Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. Welcome back everybody. Ordinarily I try and intersperse my personal stories in thematic episodes with some interviews, and a combination of time of year and also the IT meltdown that I described last week in my technology episode hasn't still been resolved. So I'm still kind of semi-computerless. So I've got a limited way of doing this. But it's meant that I'm back on doing a personal story. And I thought I'd just keep chronological for once and go with what happened to me after I'd finished being a squadron commander at RAF Strike. In the middle of 99, I'd started that job and I'd had my 2.5 years, and I'd gone through to the very beginning of 2002, and now it's time. Time's up, and you kind of see the end of a job you've been anticipating and eagerly looking forward to for a long period of time, and that's a bit of a shock. You know that the only way is the ground tour. There's no other option at that stage. I've done the flying tour I'm going to get as a wing commander. And all I can do now is hope that at some point I'm going to be back in the mix for running a station, and that's another story for another day. But it was then kind of, what next? Where do I go? What's on offer? What are the opportunities? And the way the system works, and still largely works this way to a degree, is when you fill in your annual report, the front sort of page of your annual report, one of the things you do is you express choices as to where you'd like to go and what you'd like to do. And it was commonly known as a dream sheet, because the reality was that, what you wanted to do often had little bearing on what you were actually going to end up doing, because to a large extent, it was, where are the slots? What are the opportunities? What's the Air Force require in terms of your skill set and where it's going to put you? And if they could match that up with your dream sheet, well, that was perfect. But obviously it didn't always work that way. And I was looking for good jobs. I wanted to make sure I stayed in the mix for kind of career move jobs, if you like, that were going to keep me visible and with an opportunity to further progress. And out of the woodwork popped an opportunity to go and be interviewed to be the assistant private secretary to the Secretary of State for Defense. Who at that stage was Geoffrey Hoon, Right Honourable Geoffrey Hoon. And I said, well, yeah, wow, that would be great, be really, really interesting. And I did. I went through that process. I ended up as after a first round of interviews, which was, I think, 2 candidates from each service, and we were interviewed by the then private secretary for the Secretary of State, and that got down selected to the final 3, and 3 candidates, 1 from each service. The incumbent in the role was Army, so ordinarily you would expect that it wouldn't be the Army candidate that would go in, although it was definitely best person for the job, that kind of role. But there was a degree of rotational desire for it as well. So I went for the interview, and this time it was with the private secretary, new one, who'd actually changed in the period where between the 2 interviews, and the Secretary of State himself. And I came out of that interview going, I don't think that went quite as well as I would have liked it to have gone. And I didn't get the job, bottom line. And I went through a phase of being absolutely gutted that, it was a great job. It would have been really interesting to do. At the same time, it was enormously high pressure, very challenging. You don't have a life, I don't think, really, to be honest. I think the emphasis was, you're constantly at the Secretary of State's beck and call, and would have been, required to work very, very hard to do it. So every cloud has a silver lining in that sense. And I thought, okay, well, I missed the opportunity, but okay, what's next? And one of the things, the sort of the oil on the troubled water, if you like, for me, was the then Chief of Air Staff was a chap who's a very good friend of mine to this day, called Air Chief Marshal Sir Glenn Torpey. And he said to me, said, Bob, you were the Air Force's candidate. You were the final one that got in there. That's really important. And at the end of the day, the fact you didn't get the job doesn't matter at all. And that was such good advice that I've never forgotten, because it really did help me to kind of come to terms with my personal, I guess, disappointment in myself. I was used to succeeding at what I attempted to do, not losing opportunities like that. And therefore it was very difficult to wrestle with initially. But at the same time, it definitely was, one door closes and a window somewhere else opens. And that was firmly the case here, because the next job that popped up on the kind of list for me was the one I ended up doing, which was to go and be what's called then was called the head of briefing and coordination at RAF Strike Command at High Wycombe, as it was then known. It's now RAF Air Command. High Wycombe is really the headquarters of all the main elements of the Air Force now, and even then was largely that role as well. So Strike Command was the big command that looked after everything that was operational in the Air Force. And I was going to go and work directly for the Commander-in-Chief and the Deputy Commander-in-Chief in a role that I'll describe a little bit more in a minute or two. So that was a great job. I mean, it was a really interesting, very Air Force-centered job that was going to give me some terrific insight, and I was delighted to have the opportunity to go and do that, not least on the back of obviously the disappointment of not getting the job in the Ministry of Defence. Domestically, though, this was a really, really turbulent time for me. I didn't mention it, I don't think, when I talked about going to be a squadron commander, but at around a time I moved from being on a grand tour back to flying to go and run a squadron. Unfortunately, my first marriage failed. I'll probably talk about that separately on a different episode in terms of personal things and family things and so on, but it was a combination of things, really, and ultimately it boiled down to we just spent too much time apart. I'd spent much too much time focused on the Air Force when I look back at it in hindsight, not enough time focused on family life, and that's a nature of being kind of too work focused. I think that's just a trait I have and still have, unfortunately. And I know that. I know it's a limitation in myself, and it's something I need to constantly try and pay some attention to. But it meant that when I went to my squadron commander's tour, I was in the process of getting divorced. That did not make that job easy, and added a whole extra frisson of complication to it. Luckily, the Air Force had moved and continues to move into a direction that is much more genuinely equal opportunities and not requiring people to be married. There was a time not that long before that where I would have actually lost that job, because if I wasn't married, I wouldn't have been able to go and do it. And if I wasn't going to be accompanied, I wouldn't have been able to do it either. And of course, I was able to then do it as a single man, and that made a big difference. But domestically, when I went to Coltshall, it was relatively straightforward because I was in a command job, so it meant I was entitled to a house, and I had a house to move into, even having split from my first wife. And therefore, my domestic circumstances were straightforward. I could move my kit and the two dogs that we'd had at that point, and I got custody of the dogs effectively. We're two golden retrievers. They and my kit all went perfectly in the house at Coltshall. Now I'm moving to a staff job. No entitlement to a house now. I'm a single guy. All I'm entitled to is a room in the officer's mess, or I obviously have the option to live outside the Air Force establishment, and that was clearly the only option I had at that point, because living in the mess with a house full of kit and two dogs just wasn't going to happen. I mean, there was no chance at all I would be able to do that, and so it meant a pretty frantic charge to find somewhere to live ahead of starting what was immediately, very evidently, going to be a very busy job. So that was fun. I had to go and look at 16 houses in 2 days, and then go back for some second viewings on the ones that I'd effectively shortlisted. And, in pretty rapid order, purchased a quite a nice house, actually, in the village of Downley, just on the outskirts of High Wycombe itself, the town of High Wycombe itself. And that was really different. I had that house for a few years. I lived in it, obviously, while I was at Strike Command, and subsequently I let it 2 or 3 times before ultimately selling it. And the thing it meant when I was in the High Wycombe job was because I was living in the community, and I'd never done that before. Literally never. I'd gone from school into the Air Force. I'd always lived in Air Force accommodation, be it officers' messes or when I'd got married, then obviously in Air Force married quarters, most of which were on military, or all of which actually up to that point were on military patches, as we call them. So you've got groups of military housing. And so you're in a little kind of military community, even if that is part of a wider normal civil society community. So at this time, I'm actually now living with normal civilian neighbors who, of course, were interested in what I did. And it was great to build some relationships that were kind of different to the ones that I had historically had. So that was definitely a real plus. I hadn't really expected that. It came somewhat out of the blue that because I just never really thought about it. And that living in the community thing was definitely a bonus. I was a few miles from the base, and actually it meant that I could actually cycle to work along the ridge from it was more or less flat from where I was along the ridge to go to High Wycombe itself, quite hilly round in that part of the UK. So it was a nice cycle through the woods, and I used to do that pretty much all the time to get myself to and from work, and that was definitely a bonus. The job itself was fascinating. That's the only way to describe it. I was completely different in that I'd gone from having just less than a couple of hundred people in terms of running a fast jet squadron to then going back. And I had four staff. I had 2 officers, 2 squadron leaders, and 2 airmen working for me, 1 corporal and one senior aircraftman. And their roles were to basically do a lot of the detailed work underpinning what I was doing. And as the head of briefing and coordination, I was firmly part of what is the outer office community of the headquarters. So every very senior officer has staff that work for them directly. So typically at the 2-star level, Air Vice Marshal and above, you will have a personal staff officer or a military assistant, depending on exactly where you are and what the role's called. And you'll usually have a personal assistant that works for you as well. And their job is to essentially triage and work through everything coming across your desk to make sure you get stuff in the order you need to see it in and at the right quality, so it's ready for you both to read it and or action it. So the first filter, if you like, is that set of staff that are there. My job was slightly on the periphery of that in that I wasn't working as a personal staff officer, but as the briefing and co-ord team lead, I worked directly with all the time with particularly the commander-in-chief, the 4-star officer that ran Strike Command, and his deputy, a 3-star, and their staff. And by extension, all of the senior staff at High Wycombe who worked for the commander-in-chief and the deputy, because I was pulling together the briefs and the visit programs for my 2 principals at the 3 and 4-star level. And that was the job of my team. So it was a really privileged opportunity to get right under the skin of a lot of the detail of what was going on in the Air Force, because we would literally, for every meeting that one or other of those 2 senior players was going to, we would pull together their briefing pack. And that meant going right across the command structure, usually to get inputs for that brief. And that was either a brief for a meeting. So, for example, if the commander-in-chief was going to the Air Force board, we would prepare his briefing pack with all of the notes he needed, all the information that was required, and all of the inputs from all of the different people working for him. So getting that in from the other senior staff and their own staff, so their own outer offices, was a key role that we had in time and in the right quality to make sure that actually it was ready to go, kind of oven ready, if you like, to go into the briefing pack to then go in front of the commander-in-chief. Attention to detail, therefore, was a massive part of this job, because we were the final filter before it actually went to the senior man. And obviously it was very important to ensure that literally every T was crossed and every I was dotted. and that the formatting was as he needed it to be to make sure it was efficient for him to work and get through the meeting and to make the points he needed and so on and so forth. So it was a hugely detail-focused job. It was also an incredibly interesting one because it gave me a set of insights into all sorts of things going on in bits of the Air Force that I'd never had anything to do with. On the support side, on the helicopter side, on the wider transport side, even on the fast jet side, large chunks of things that I had no idea about and had never been been involved with at all. And suddenly now I'm right in the detail of this, having to not only just filter stuff and write stuff and put it together in a brief, but understand it and make sure where if necessary, I was pulling the bones out and pré-seeing it to turn around and ensure that at the front of his brief he had all the key notes that he really needed. These are the key lines to take. These are the things that were going to be the most important elements to get there. And as you can probably imagine, that kind of job, because I was doing that kind of filtration, prioritization, if you like, of some of the stuff that was coming in, it got a bit political occasionally because suddenly I would be turning around and saying, no, actually, this issue is more important than that issue because I know that's what the CNC thinks. And, I would then get my collar felt by one of the 2-star or 3-star officers that was potentially feeling that, well, actually, no, my issue is more important than that. You need to be doing this. Oh, wing commander, get on and do it. And so being somewhat the meat in the sandwich there was a bit tricky occasionally. But I have to say, I absolutely loved the challenge of the job, and I loved the fact that it played to my quite detail-orientated mind. I've always been very particular about written work, too much so in many ways. But that was a job where it really did demand that you paid absolute attention. So I would read every word of every big brief, and these were quite often big briefs that we'd be putting up in front of the commander-in-chief or the deputy commander-in-chief, and if anything was wrong, we would go and challenge it, find out the facts, make sure we had the right kind of input. If there was pieces missing, we needed to get the extra pieces. If there were things that needed correcting, simplifying, clarifying, whatever, we would obviously have to make sure that that work went there. And so that side of it was really, really interesting and was the sort of the back office function, if you like, that was there. Much more front office, though, was we also put together the visit briefings for any visiting senior officers or senior delegations that were coming into the command, and or the CNC was going to have to go and brief or elsewhere. And so that meant literally pulling together the PowerPoint presentations and either making sure that the CNC was happy that he was going to give the brief himself and he had everything he needed, or more normally actually giving the brief for him. So if we were doing it at High Wycombe, what would typically happen is we'd have a senior inward visitor. I would then be in the room giving the brief, and the commander-in-chief or his deputy would be sat at the head of the table with the visitor and going through what they felt they needed to say to turn around and add on to that brief. So effectively, I was just the kind of office boy up the front that was delivering the brief for him. And that was one actually interesting aspect of moving from being a squadron commander, where you felt quite a big fish in in a relatively small pond with 4 squadrons at or 3 squadrons actually at RAF Cultural, plus some other bits and pieces. And you're then in. Now I'm very much back to being a small fish in a pretty big pond at High Wycombe, and that was definitely something that took a little bit of getting used to. But it was that privileged access thing that was really, really valuable, because it meant that for any one of those big briefings, I would be there for the whole session, often taking the minutes. I used to also take the minutes and be the secretary to the command group. That's the CNC senior meeting that he had with all of the senior players. So those meetings were pretty intense and pretty full on in terms of the quantity and speed of the debate, and capturing all of that and being able to have a proper set of contemporaneous minutes, was really, really important. So that was a skill I had to really develop in terms of my own, not only attention to detail in terms of paying attention to what was going on, but being able to capture it in a way that was really user friendly for me to then record it and produce a decent set of minutes that everyone was going to agree to and sign off on. And actually, that was one of the other relatively interesting things after after some of those meetings, because what you would have quite regularly is something had been said, it had been recorded, a decision had been reached, that was captured. I then produced a set of minutes. The minutes would get circulated in draft to all those that had attended, and then I'd be rung up by one or other of the people that had been at the meeting saying, well, actually, Bob, yeah, I know that's what was said, but what we meant to say was this. And of course, I would have the dilemma of, yeah, I know you might have meant to say that, sir, but actually what you did say was this, and therefore, unless the CNC agrees it, that's what's going to go in the minutes. And that was quite a delicate walk a lot of the time. So the sort of diplomatic skills bit came out slightly in there, and the whole job did develop me in terms of my breadth of knowledge, my exposure to what was going on in the wider Air Force, my ability to work at a very senior level with senior people, and it really shaped me a lot for some of the things that were to then come later in my career, and that was hugely helpful. We did have some hilarious moments though, because not only was there this massive cat herding exercise to actually get the content and input into the briefs, and often people would be very last minute with what they were supplying, and of course they would forget that they were supplying it to you against a deadline that actually usually we had set the deadline, but our deadlines, we'd try not to pad them too much. We wanted to give the staff the maximum amount of time to prepare the brief, and get everything sorted. But at the same time, we needed to give ourselves enough time to actually do the finessing and get everything put together and get all the formatting right, do all the printing, make sure that everything was in the right order. And so getting that right was challenging, because obviously we would often be working pretty long hours late in the day to turn around and make sure that before a big thing that we had everything in the right place, because we would always be missing something, or something needed refinement or further input, et cetera, et cetera. So, that was, again, pretty interesting from the challenge point of view. The other thing that was was funny in hindsight, wasn't funny at the time, was when we did the presentations to senior visitors. Usually, of course, we had a pretty standard Strike Command presentation that we would keep up to date and would keep modifying, and would do work with the senior principals to ensure it was saying everything they wanted it to say, and it was and had kind of the right kind of images in it and videos and so on and so forth where we needed to. And bear in mind, technology was different then to the way it is today, so that was was definitely part of that challenge. But also we needed to make sure that it was accurate. It was it was delivered well. We didn't have a script. We worked very hard on trying to make sure that it flowed very, very well and effectively, because we did it a lot and the brief was relatively constant and consistent. It was quite easy to do that, and I would particularly do it a lot, and was therefore very comfortable with giving the brief. What we would do as well is if we had if it was a NATO visitor, then because the English is the language of NATO, we would leave the slides in English. If we had a visitor from somewhere outside NATO and we had enough time and enough notice, we would attempt to get the slides translated to, so the slides would be in the visitor's language, and I would obviously give the brief in English, but then it would mean that the takeaway for him in terms of the slide pack and so on, where we're giving him, that would be in his language. And one particular occasion, we had a Middle Eastern visitor, very senior one, coming in to sit with the commander in chief and go through the sort of presentation on everything to do with Strike Command. We'd sent the slides off. We'd got them translated into Arabic. They'd come back. They looked for all the world as if they were in Arabic, based on the fact I don't speak Arabic or read Arabic. That was an assumption on my part. What we completely failed to recognize was that we should have, I guess, properly cross-checked this, because when we put the brief up, I think we were on slide 2 or 3 when this senior Middle Eastern visitor, very politely but kind of firmly, I suppose, turned to the commander-in-chief and said, Marshal, I'm very sorry to say, but I'm not sure what language these slides are in, but it is not Arabic. And I aged about 10 years in 5 seconds thinking, oh my God, what's happened? Have we made this huge error? The commander-in-chief actually took it in pretty good heart, and we just switched the slide deck and put the English one up, and it was exactly, it was fine. He spoke English anyway. It wasn't a big deal at all. what had turned out to be the problem was we'd got the slides back, and I'm sure that they'd actually been faithfully translated into Arabic, and that was accurately done. But when we had input the back into our own system, then the font set somehow had changed everything on the slides. So now they were meaningless, and they weren't usable at all as Arabic slides. So for all my comments about attention to detail, this was one where it really fell through the cracks, and in some ways not our fault, but in a big learning point for me was think about, in those sorts of situations, are you absolutely sure it is what you think it is? Is there anything you need to do to be really confident and improve your confidence that this is going to be the right kind of outcome? And that's a useful lesson that I still work to today. If I'm not 100% sure, I'll try and find somebody that can give me that confidence and just give you that extra check to ensure that what you've got in front of you is actually what you're hoping it to be, particularly if you don't fully understand it yourself. The final thing I wanted to talk about in this job was one of the big things that happened, which was the Second Gulf War. So I'd arrived at the beginning of 2002, and then obviously the beginning of 2003. We were heading into very rapidly into the follow-on from the 1990 Gulf War. It'd been pending for an awful long time, where actually there was going to be a big move that ultimately saw the ousting of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This time, of course, I wasn't anywhere near the front line, and disappointing as that was, the Jaguar Force wasn't involved in Gulf War II in terms of operational delivery, so I didn't miss out directly, as it were, as I had done in the first Gulf War. But what it meant for me was, because I was in this very influential and central position within the hierarchy, I had an absolutely key seat in the meetings as we ran up in the preparation to that, and that was fascinating. That was truly fascinating, because I was still preparing the briefs and the presentations for the Commander-in-Chief to give on everything to do with that. And obviously, in the run-up to that, this information was incredibly sensitive, and so we were working what we call compartmented information. So right up at the top secret level, the highest level of classification. Beyond that, you can actually have compartments where you have to be specifically read in to be able to turn around and access and use that information. And I was read into all the relevant compartments for all the planning that was going on for Gulf War II. And again, that gave me some really great insight and some great opportunity to learn and sit in briefings where I was listening to not least senior Americans who'd come across, talking about the planning, what we were going to do, what the strategy was going to look like, where we saw our weak spots, where we saw our kind of positives, etc. And that was a really, really, really interesting place to be at a time that was obviously quite historical in no uncertain terms. It was a great social tour too. We had great fun. We would go out with the Commander-in-Chief and do stuff with him. He was a very sociable guy, as was his deputy, and would have lots of times where we'd go out for a meal, or go out for some drinks, or go around to their houses and those sorts of things. And so the actual kind of inner workings bit of the service continued in its normal vein there, where we did have that very good social life that went along with a pretty hard work life. And so all in all, it was just a fabulous opportunity. And at the time was ticking along. I'd been there by this stage, knocking on 18 months. We were just coming at the back of Gulf War II. And suddenly, out of the blue, really, I hadn't expected it. And it came along that I got promoted. And so I was now going to be a group captain. And that meant, obviously, I was going to move from that job. And where was I going to go? And I ended up moving to be the group captain Typhoon at Headquarters 1 Group. So staying at RAF High Wycombe, moving buildings. So I was no longer in Strike Command. I was going to be part of 1 Group and looking after the introduction to service for the Typhoon, which the really interesting piece for me was I had been worried a little bit that my opportunities to go and command a station were diminishing because the Jaguar Force was winding down. The opportunity to go and command Coldshaw, the only Jaguar station, therefore was looking quite like it wasn't going to come my way. And so I'm thinking, where am I going to go? What's this going to look like for me? How am I going to end up now with a with a next step? Because without a station command, the chances are that certainly then you had no prospect really of further advancement. You were going to be stuck and just miss out, and that would have been pretty much the end of my career. So this was a big deal. I was now moving to the Typhoon Force, and to be there at an absolutely pivotal time for it. That's another story. We'll come back to that on another personal stories episode before too long. I hope this has been interesting and not so much useful to you, but at least interesting in terms of my journey. Some of the things that I think come out of it that are very relevant in leadership roles are that whole piece around attention to detail and focusing on what really matters and making sure that you're being diplomatic, you're herding the cats, you're getting the the inputs you need, and you're quality controlling them in the right kind of way. And those were the things I really, really took away from what was a very, very interesting and fascinating chapter, not least on the domestic front that I touched on at the very beginning of it. So that's it for now. Look forward to catching you on the next one soon. Hopefully I've got some more great guests that are all lined up that I'm going to have as soon as I get my IT sorted. I'll have back on the podcast for you as well. But until then, all the very best. Take care and keep sending me that feedback. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.